So, thank you for being here today. Thank you, Professor Bezanko. Thank you, Professor Peterson. Thank you, Cory, team, and the KSA for organizing this debate. I will use those 3 minutes to explain you a few concepts and also let you know about what happened in the US for the last 17 years and the last 15 years. So the first important things to know is the difference between hemp and marijuana. Marijuana is a name given to the psychotropic plant, but the old name for this plant is hemp, and hemp has been following human beings for the last 5,000 years. So it's a crop that humanity has been using for many years before it has been forbidden. So the history of this prohibition started in 1937, and at this time America started to put a ban on marijuana cultivation. I will be able to come back later on this point, but what is important to know is that since this time, marijuana has been forbidden in the US. Today there is many discussion about marijuana. People talk about legalization, some others talk about decriminalization. It's important to explain the difference. Legalization just put back marijuana as a normal product, maybe with some regulation like alcohol or tobacco. Decriminalization is just making people who use marijuana not put in jail for this use. Okay. So for the last 17 years, hemp has been banned. It has different impacts, so the industry couldn't really use the crop to develop. There has not been any innovation on this product. The war on drugs that has been happening for the last 17 years has cost more than $1 trillion, and there were more than 25 million people who has been jailed for the use of hemp. At the same time, the potential medical use of this plant has not been studied until 1995, and then there has been no innovation. For the last 15 years, the situation has changed in the US, and 17 states have started to regulate hemp. Today we see that this crop has huge potential, both on the medical side, where it's proved to be a preventive and also a curative plant for major issues like even cancer, that some cancer has been proved to be able to be cured by this plant. And it also has a very strong possibilities for the industry and the ecology, as well as a big impact on economy. Some projection about hemp says that this crop could generate more than $100 billion within the next year. So for all those reasons, because we think that one shouldn't be forbidden to use a plant with little harm to itself and no harm to others, because we think that penalties against drug use shouldn't be more damaging to user than drug itself, we trust like 55% of the population that marijuana legalization is the right move for society today.
Thank you. Now we turn to the team arguing against the resolution, and either Mitchell or Cory.
Can I check the mic? Just
Cory will do it.
Can everybody? Okay, good. I thank you all for coming here, and I would urge both the audience and my opposition to stay focused on the crux of the debate today. We must consider the motion from the viewpoint of society as a whole, and we cannot get distracted by discussions regarding the individual. More to the point, the motion here today is regarding legalization. Medical marijuana and decriminalization are two vastly different options, both deserving a discussion of their own, far away from the implications and complications that are associated with full-scale marijuana legalization. With that said, the onus falls on my opposition to prove that legalization has the incremental benefits over the other options that is worthy of reversing a long-standing moral and legal standing that every nation in this world, with the one exception of North Korea, rely on. On the other hand, by legalizing marijuana, you send the message that it's now okay to use. At a time when we're trying to reverse the amount of people that are smoking cigarettes, legalizing marijuana is seen as almost an endorsement, one that our children are surely to pick up on. I ask my opponents, does this mean that you're comfortable with an increase in usage? Before you answer, I would point you to a study provided by the US Department of Health and Human Services that says that the earlier a child starts smoking marijuana, the more likely they are to progress on to using cocaine and heroin. A similar study shows that in children between ages 12 and 17, those that use marijuana are 85 times more likely to move on to cocaine use. But this isn't the only thing. In addition, there are health effects. These health effects include respiratory illness, learning and memory problems, increased heart rate, anxiety, depression, suicidal thoughts, and schizophrenia. I'd ask you to consider the arguments made by my opposition as they're about to start making projections on economical, social, other issues. And I would ask that when they make these arguments, you replace the word marijuana with other words. These words would be heroin, cocaine, methamphetamines, prostitution. If their arguments stand when you make this replacement, I would argue that their arguments aren't valid in the beginning. With that, Merwan mentioned the economic benefits of legalization. Not only can I point to you studies that show that the costs of legalization far outweigh the benefits, I would argue that that argument can be applied to cocaine, heroin, methamphetamines, prostitution. Are we still okay with that argument? Further, the curative methods is a little bit of a joke. There's no FDA-proven drug or accepted drug that is used by means of smoking. And we already have a THC drug, Marinol, that's been available since 1985. Thank you.
Thank you. And now back to the pro-resolution team. Tim?
Well, thank you everybody for coming, and thank you for Merwan for serving on our team with us, and Cory and Mitchell, thank you for being here as well. And I'm thrilled to be here, and delighted in particular to be arguing in favor of this resolution, because what's interesting about this topic is the more you dig into it, and the more you learn about the history of the story, and the more you think about the pros and the cons, the more it becomes clear, and I think broadly so, that the benefits so far outweigh the cons here, that this is really quite an easy decision, I think, in many respects. The benefits, well, because what's interesting in this situation, you go through the benefits, and you know, certainly if you legalize marijuana, there are economic benefits for society in many respects. There are health benefits in terms of the medicinal use of this product that are quite compelling, and the data is quite intriguing on that front. And beyond that, there also are criminal benefits here, because what's going to happen is by decriminalizing this and legalizing it, we're going to reduce the incentive of nefarious figures to embrace this market. And there are many benefits to sort of going this way. And then you look at the issues and the reasons not to do it. And I think what we'll see more of today is that a lot of those issues, under really sort of scrutiny, just don't hold up too well. You know, the health issues, you know, what we know is that all the evidence says this is not a particularly dangerous product. It's not addictive, right? You can't overdose on it. I mean, apparently the only way you can really overdose on marijuana is if you choke on it. But beyond that, it doesn't really cause any damage. The data of people progressing is highly debatable when you look at some of the studies on this. And you sort of tick through the reasons against it. And what you realize, and what's amazing, really, is that so many societies have come up on that side of the equation. This is one of those times, I think, where you have to take a fresh look at the issue. And you have to really look at it and say, well, why do we do this? You know, many times in business, and I think many times in society, we find ourselves doing things, and we never really ask the question about how did we end up in that space. And I think this is one of those situations, because the more you look at it, the more you realize that the benefits of legalization are, I think, very compelling. And the reasons against it are really very feeble in a way. And I know our opponents here today will work diligently to convince us otherwise, and I salute them for their efforts. But I think if you really look at it, this is really going to be a pretty easy decision today. So I look forward to more of the discussion, but this one to me I think is going to be a fairly easy decision.
Thank you, Tim. And finally, Mitchell, for an opening statement by the team against the resolution.
Few of you know that in sophomore year of high school, I was also matched with a debate partner whose name began with C. It was a guy named Chip Maggot. And behind my back, they used to refer to our team as Chip and Dip. I think this matchup is very similar. Remember, the focus of the question we have is, do we want to legalize marijuana? If it has medical benefits, you can get that through the medical post. If you want to eliminate some of the cost of enforcement, you can get that through decriminalization. And so the question you're being asked is not relative to those is it good, but do you take that third step and you actually legalize it? There are very few places we've looked at this. So the RAND is a nonprofit economic research institution in California that was on their own mission, decided to sort of ask the question, if California were to legalize this, what would it be? And some of the research is theirs and some of it's going to be brought back. And you're going to see dueling studies. So what you want to do is you want to think underneath the studies, what's the logic or intuition, because you've never really had the full-scale example. Now, looking at the other literature, they found that for California, they estimated somewhere between a $200 to a $1.9 billion cost of regulation. Because remember, this isn't decriminalization. You have to have a regular authority if you're going to start doing this, and we're going to have Eli Lilly switch to marijuana. And we're going to have people starting to produce marijuana brownies, because we need a regulatory structure around that. If you gross that up to the nation, on the low end, that's only about $1.7 billion. That doesn't sound a lot. But when you think about how strapped the state and local governments are, we're talking that's the amount of money I could make for 1 million kids having a school lunch. So when you start to think about the trade-off, there are costs when there's limited resources. Now, how is this going to change the economics? Well, Professor Culkin did say this will be an incredible boom, because when this becomes legalized, the cost of production will drop dramatically. In fact, the cost of production will drop somewhere to about $300 to $400 per pound. That's about 1/10 of the cost at a small scale. Now, imagine if you could do that in a huge factory. Those economies of scale we teach you about will get even smaller. We've never had that ramp up. The labor costs are going to drop because now you don't have to have the risk premium for paying your employees because it's a legal source. So RAND estimates you might have a drop in cost on the market of about 60 to 80%. 80% with no taxes, 60% if you put a huge tax. And the tax they're thinking about is something like $50 an ounce. That's half the purchase price at this case. When you look at beer, it's 7%. When you look at liquor, it's 11%. So even at a 50% tax, you're not making enough money to cover this, and prices drop dramatically. Now, I know from my economics course that the lower the price is, the more I can buy something of it. So one of the reasons you're going to see some of the studies lead to more consumption is just that income effect. And for those mature adults that we think about, that results, RAND thinks, may be a 50 to 117% increase. Now, other studies say it's going to be a decrease. There's a set of population, I'd call them more vulnerable members of society. We might call them children, high school students, who might do this because it's illegal. It's not so much I want the marijuana, but I want to do something illegal. Now, if you make this legal, that's not going to change your average high school student. They're still going to have to search for something that's illegal. What is the choice if it's not marijuana? One way to sort of ask how the children are affected is ask the pediatricians. In 2004, the Pediatric Association asked the pediatricians, what do you think should happen to marijuana? And 18% of the pediatricians favored it being legalized. 26% thought it should still be a felony. And the ones in between argued for the medical option or argued for decriminalization. And really, that's where we're coming to. Do you want to make it okay for medical marijuana? That's not the question. Do you want to decriminalize it? That's not the question. The question is that third and final step toward full legalization.
Thank you. And now, in proper order, I will ask some questions, and I'm going to start with the pro-legalization team. The main point of marijuana, outside of medicinal uses, is that it makes you feel good when you consume it. Maybe it makes you more social. Maybe it makes you less inhibited. It can be argued, up to a point, that society has no significant interest in outlawing people from doing things that give them pleasure, as long as those things don't inflict significant harm on others. But there are things that give some people pleasure that apparently don't cause harm to others, for which society has said, no, we are going to draw a line. A virtuous society does not endorse these things, even though there is a market, because we think these things debase us as human beings. Prostitution, perhaps, would be an example of that. Dogfighting, perhaps. would be an example of that. We're better as humans for not engaging in these activities. Now, outside of medical uses, aren't we better, finally my question, aren't we better as humans for not becoming stoned on marijuana? Aren't we better off as a society for not being a population of stoners? Doesn't the legalization of marijuana take us a step toward debating us as humans and as citizens?
Vast question. um, so first, I'd like to draw myself a line between prostitution, dogfight, and marijuana use, because prostitution can harm people, especially when it's human trafficking. Dogfight is obviously harming dogs, and which is I'm quite concerned for animal health, so I found it can't be compared to the use of marijuana. And marijuana is not harming other when you use marijuana. If you compare it to other substances like alcohol, for example, marijuana is not generating domestic violence or crime or other things that you can see with other drug abuse. So this is the first line I would put between your example and the use of marijuana. And marijuana is truly a substance which is not harming other. Even regarding data about driving impairment, it has been proved by different studies, and I know this is maybe a first controversial data, but my role today is also to bring you data about that. Driving impairment is not proven under marijuana because people who are using marijuana have a less aggressive driving, they have slower speed, and different slower speed, yes, and different studies made on sample of 2,500 injured persons has shown that there were less people under just marijuana use than people without any substance in the blood. So, to come back to your question, thinking that marijuana is impairing human being or something like that is much more a moral question and should be kept for individuals. I think that in a country like United States, people are free to choose what they want to do as long as they respect the law, and the point of this kind of debate is to change the law.
Any rebuttal, Cory or Mitchell?
Please. I found it interesting that he tried to draw a line between the prostitution argument and define it as different because others are injured in the prostitution business, especially human trafficking. But I would argue that's exactly the reason for legalizing prostitution, if you're to make that argument. By regulating and legalizing, you remove the aspect of the criminality involved, you make it more regulated and a much safer environment so that people don't fall into issues of human trafficking. And I think a number of studies show that. If we move on to other issues that he brought up, he said that marijuana doesn't lead to things like domestic violence the way that alcohol does. But I would argue that physical violence isn't the only way that you can hurt your family. I think that neglect is another way that you can do this, especially if you have children. You can neglect your children. If you have a wife, you can neglect your wife. You can be too tired or burnt out to go to work the next day. I think there's other ways that you can be damaging and have damaging effects from a drug other than just the reaction of when you're on that drug. Dealing with driving impairment, it's a really interesting issue because there was, the CBC did a discovery on trying to analyze how people are impacted when they drove. And one of the issues was that a lot of people under the influence that they believed would impair driving were still fine at driving. But then they decided to push the envelope and give them more and more joints, more and more marijuana to smoke. And what they found was, even in a sample size as small as 10 people, the variance on what people are able to drive under which influence changed extremely amongst the participants. So what that means is, once we legalize, if you do, you now have an issue of enforcement. What level do you decide is driving under impairment? With alcohol, we can do blood alcohol tests, and there's a direct correlation to impairment. With marijuana, what line do you draw? The amount that Merwan can drive under may be a lot more than the amount that I can drive under. And as such, how are the police supposed to know when they should take us into jail? And finally, the issue of the morality in the criminalizing marijuana just brings me back to the aspect that we're not discussing decriminalization or medical marijuana. If you want to take the criminality out of it, and you want to take away the enforcement issue, you can decriminalize. There's no need to move on to full-scale legalization. Okay.
Let me move things along by posing a question to the anti-legalization team.
Can I just jump in on 1 second on that? That debate?
30 seconds.
What's that? 30 seconds.
seconds.
Yeah, very quickly. Yeah. So you look at it, and marijuana. There's no real evidence it's harmful for individuals. There's no evidence that it's harmful to others. So in a way, the debasement question comes down to: is it wrong to feel to have a substance that is somehow pleasurable? Right, but I would argue, boy, that's a very tricky line, because hot tubs could fall into that same category, right? Or coffee could fall into the same category of things we do that are pleasurable, that are fine. I mean, you could make the case, actually, that marijuana perhaps maybe elevates us, and it relaxes us in a moment that is too stressful and too high-strung, and maybe it doesn't debase us, maybe it elevates us, perhaps.
So a question for the team arguing against the resolution. What would you say to families of dead Mexican citizens, and there are thousands of them, who were tragic victims of the crossfire spurred by U.S. demand for marijuana and the criminal organizations that have arisen to supply it because it is illegal? Does the U.S. have blood on its hands because of its policy of criminalizing marijuana?
These are the Colombian marijuana gangs that we're talking about?
Yeah.
I thought that was cocaine. How much
It's
of
both,
that
actually.
violence is cocaine and how much of that violence is marijuana? So before you're going to make the argument that legalizing marijuana is going to eliminate that, you have to argue that it's not some other substance. And ask yourself, are those gangs that are bringing those drugs across, are they in this because it's a deep moral desire to get marijuana to someone? Or is it a profit motive and they don't care about the legality? And if you wipe out this business they have with other legitimate businesses, you take marijuana away, where are they going to spend their money? Where are they going to spend their human resources? The assumption that they will then shut down, that profit is not what's going on, that's a very hard case to make. In fact, you have a bunch of businesses that are illegal both south of the border and in the border that will be wiped out. And so one of the things you need to think about is how will that change? Second comment. If this really is about that criminality, can you get that with decriminalization? And remember, the question we're asking is, do you go beyond that step of decriminalization to make it legal?
Rebuttal from the arguing for the resolution.
So, I'd like to attack directly the statement about the fact that marijuana is leading to cocaine, heroin, and all those things consumption, because the data we have about that shows
I'm going to actually, I want to rebuttal to the points that these folks just made right now, and we can come to that if you'd like. In fact, I have a question for you that may actually lead directly to that. But I want any rebuttal to what Professor Peterson just said.
You want to answer?
I think if you legalize something, what's going to happen is the motive for criminal behavior in that space is going to diminish, because all of a sudden you will open up the market to more legitimate players to come into it, and you will squeeze out the illegal players. So clearly, if you legalize marijuana, we're going to see that. Now, one note: the distinction between decriminalizing and legalizing is a very strange line people are drawing, right? Because when you decriminalize it, you make it not a criminal offense, but it's still not legal. So you can still be, well, it's just a very strange, like you can't, it's not legal to grow it, but you can possess it, that's a very funny line. I think if we legalize it, what's going to happen is we're going to reduce that criminal incentive. The argument that says we need to give something for these illicit gangs to do to make money is, I think, a tricky argument. I mean, I think the argument they're going to do something. I see that argument, right? Because clearly they're going to try to keep making money. But I'm not sure that's a compelling argument, because that would then say, well, we have to allow the gangs to flourish.
That's not the argument I'm making.
Mitchell, 30-second rebuttal.
I'm making the argument that arguing a benefit of these criminal gangs will happily shut down. I believe that's a pipe dream. So whether we legalize it or not legalize it or criminalize it, I don't see a change in that. So it's very hard to argue that's a benefit.
So there is a previous experience that happened in Portugal, where all the drugs has been decriminalized in 2001, and where there has been a big drop of consumption.
Were they legalized?
Decriminalized.
So not legalized?
Not legalized. So there has been a big drop in consumption, but still there is still the mafia, which is still operating behind. So it means that basically you just give a free market to the mafia to operate. And it's the same problem in Holland. The mafia still exists. There is still the economy, which is fueling the providing of different substances, including cocaine, heroin, and other things. And when you just decriminalize, you don't cut the money which is going to those mafia.
Let me move us along with a question for the pro-legalization team. And I think it was the one that you were eager to answer a moment ago, actually. No one is seriously recommending legalization of heroin or cocaine. So, what are the 2 or 3 or 4 bullet points that define the bright line, the very bright line, for these folks to clearly see that separates heroin and cocaine, illegal, from marijuana, which you advocate illegal? What are the 3 or 4 bullet points that identify what that bright line really is?
This is quite a tough question, because I would say that the trend today in the world regarding drug legalization is that as long as it's a natural plant, most of the country tries to legalize the plant in order, because those plants are traditionally used by local people. You have the example of coca in Peru, which is today legalized. People in Peru can use the coca leaves. You have the marijuana, which is just a plant before being a drug, and it has become more and more potent when people have started to industrialize it and transform it in hashish in order to smuggle the drug. And same for pavo, the heroin, before it has been smuggled and used by traffickers. It was just a plant, and people used to self-medicate with it. So I would say that the real line between all those drugs should be that as long as the plant is used in its natural form, it should be legalized. Once you start to process it to increase the potency, then you should have different regulation.
I'm going to actually ask, in lieu of a rebuttal, I'm going to ask the same question of the opposing team. You're free as part of your answer to give a rebuttal. But basically the same question. No one is seriously recommending outlawing cigarettes and alcohol. Perhaps that is what you're willing to advocate for, but I haven't heard that yet. No one is seriously advocating outlawing cigarettes and booze. So what are the 3 or 4 bullet points that for these folks identify the bright line that separates legal cigarettes and alcohol from illegal, should be illegal, according to you, marijuana?
So I think one of the major issues you need to understand is the direction that you're working in. If we were to today have everything on a clean slate and start to discuss, then you have a lot of different issues that you look at. But what you're talking about is stripping away existing organizations and existing systems that society as a whole have agreed upon. And let's not forget that this is something that isn't just the United States that agrees on. This is every nation in the world agrees on marijuana, with the exception, of course, of North Korea. And we can see how rational they are in the moment. But most of the other nations in the world also agree that tobacco and alcohol should be free. And so I think that it's a matter of whether or not you are willing to take that moral step out in the front and say that we will be the forefront and we will be the ones to decide, be the moral police on this issue. And I don't think that that's the case right now. I don't think that the transaction costs and the frictions involved in moving straight to a legalization and all the problems that are associated with it are worth it today. And if the situation changes in the future, that may be an issue. But right now, there's nothing to point that there is value of going to that third step, as Professor Peterson mentioned.
Let me ask for a rebuttal, and maybe a rebuttal, and then we'll open it up to questions.
There we on the line between these different substances, I think it's an interesting question to ponder on. To me, two questions might be significant. One is, how addictive are these products? Because in theory, that is something that individuals might not be able to understand and evaluate, not knowing the chemical makeup. And how harmful are they? And so in theory, if you use that, and by the way, that's a line that is drawn all the time. So addictive products, like in the world of pharmaceuticals, we have controlled pharmaceuticals, where we are very careful about how many people take, and then we have pharmaceuticals that aren't controlled, and that's a very familiar line for everyone. And to me, what's interesting, if you on that criteria, if you look at it, you would say marijuana actually not particularly addictive, not particularly harmful, right? So of the options we're looking at, boy, that one you would say, remarkably actually, you would almost put it sort of the extreme. I actually think, sort of from that perspective, you could have a bigger debate maybe about alcohol, because that one is more addictive, more harmful. But I think even there, what we've learned is that prohibiting some of these things, even when we know maybe we should, right, it doesn't necessarily work, because you can't stop demand, and that just fosters the criminal element. So I think in that respect, this becomes, again, you look at it like, well, certainly this one on that line would be well south of the line.
And a quick rebuttal to Professor Calkins' rebuttal.
So the addictive measure, I think that a lot of the studies that are shown is regarding to chemical addiction, which some of the studies are showing that on the lower THC level, marijuana is less chemically addictive. However, most psychological studies that have been reported and peer-reviewed show that there is a how can I say this, a social addiction to it, a behavioral addiction, something that's not from the body, but the act of smoking marijuana creates this, as you said, slightly euphoric feeling that people want to get back to. It's not so much that the body goes through withdrawal, it's that they do have this addiction. Now, I would go to the fact that tobacco is the nicotine in tobacco is extremely addictive. So to answer his question, if we were to make tobacco illegal today, I believe that in that specific argument, making tobacco illegal creates more harm than good to society, because the number of people that would be able to readily get off tobacco now that it's illegal is fairly small. So you're essentially saying all smokers are now going to jail, which I think on that level, on that discussion on its own, it creates more harm than good to make it illegal. And that's, again, what we're discussing, legalization of marijuana, harm versus benefit in that state.
Let's now open it up to you all to ask questions. Please raise your hand, tell us your name, wait for a microphone, and tell us to which team you are directing your question. Yes, please, in the back in the second. Yes, sir.
I'm Sam Wampler, first year here. I think it's very interesting to see the negative team sort of co-opt area outside of the resolution and really almost see the status quo, almost admitting that what's happening now is not working. I'd like to hear, rather than attacking legalization in against a standpoint of decriminalization or medicalization, I'd like to hear you guys advocate the benefits of those two things as opposed to legalization exclusively. Because if you want to take that space for your own in this debate, I think you need to articulate some of the positives that come along with that legalization does not bring with it in and of itself.
So we'll direct that to Professor Peterson and Cory, and then if Merwan and Professor Calkins wish to respond.
So if I understand, you want me to argue for something else. So, yeah. So to quote my esteemed colleague Merwan, if you have marijuana, there's certain medical benefits to do it. And if you do that in a context where it's within a regulatory structure, under the care of a doctor, and back to my comment that there are some personalities who can handle substances and there's some personalities that can't, that seems like a much more viable action. In terms of sort of the decriminalization, there are certain activities that we find we would like to discourage because they have social pressure, but we don't throw you in jail. I am certain that you have never gone over the speed limit on any major interstate highway in this country. But there are other people in this room that may have. And so we want to discourage that because we think it's unsafe to drive too quickly, so we have speed limits. And you'll notice that if you're 10 miles over the speed limit, we do say that's illegal. We do fine you. We have the inconvenience by having a police officer humiliate you for a while as a way to discourage it. But we also have this expectation that if we say 55, people are going to go 65. If we say 65, people are going to go 75. So I think those are the arguments that our opponents as well as us would have argued.
Response?
We've told about. Shall I answer the question, or can I just reply?
I would ask that you rebut what Professor Peterson just said, if you want to, not necessarily.
You can agree with me.
I'd like to talk about the fact that marijuana is today a treatment, a medicine, and you mentioned the fact that some medical, some drugs can be produced by the pharmaceutical industry, which has the same effect than marijuana, like Marinol, for example, or Sativex. And the fact is that marijuana is composed with more than 200 different chemicals, and the pharmaceutical industry can only synthesize 2 or 3 chemicals at the same time. So the full spectrum that marijuana can provide to different people, which has different problem, is not covered today by the pharmaceutical industry.
Can I jump in just one note on the driving front? The speed limit, I think, analogy is perfect, right, for this situation, right? Because if you're driving too fast, right, there's real societal costs there, right? You can crash into somebody, it's dangerous. You can hurt somebody. You're flagrant with the resources and all of that. And in a way, you could argue driving too fast in a way is much worse than taking marijuana in your home. And yet, you look how we handle it. And driving too fast, people say, oh, of course you can drive too fast. And even if you're caught, well, you get a little ticket and a couple points on the license, and you go to a course, and it's okay. But marijuana, if you're caught with that, no, jail.
That's
Which
the
is really
criminalization,
strange.
right?
That's a strange...
That's the criminalization of the point. And so that's why I say we can have penalties, but the question is not to make it criminalization. I like your idea, though, that marijuana, it actually expands your horizons, makes you think better. Don't answer this. This is a rhetorical question, but do any of you take marijuana before the exams? Are any of you comfortable with the pilot on your next flight smoking marijuana? Because there really isn't bad.
So with that, I will ask for another question.
I'd like to push back.
I want to get some more questions from students. So yes, please.
Hi, Robin Chen, second year. First of all, I want to thank both sides for a riveting debate so far. So I came into this debate thinking that I'm for the legalization of marijuana, and a lot of it was because I feel like it's very similar to the legalization of alcohol debate that happened during Prohibition and all that. So my question is for the team that's against the legalization of marijuana, which is, can you provide some direct comparison between this issue and the legalization of alcohol, and what specific things about marijuana that makes you guys think that it's not it's not going to create benefits or going to create harm to society. And before you guys answer, I just want to say, please do not provide any arguments around the fact that marijuana is going to debase humans or make people immoral, because that's the same argument that they created about alcohol. And obviously, not everyone decided to drink alcohol and become alcoholics when they legalized alcohol.
So I think that the main issue you need to consider is, if today we flipped a switch and all of a sudden marijuana was legal, what are the issues associated with that? And again, comparing back to medical marijuana and decriminalization, one of the issues where alcohol wins out on this is the fact that regulation is significantly easier in the alcohol industry than it is with dealing with marijuana. The amount of history behind it, for one, the amount of institutional companies that are used to regulating is a big issue. I go back to the fact that the study showed that a believed level of intoxication under marijuana affected your driving, and it showed that that level wasn't consistent amongst pretty much any two people that you put in the same room. So all of the complications associated with legalizing marijuana are, how do we regulate it? What THC level do we agree upon? Do we sell different THC levels? How do we ensure that which impurities are okay and which impurities are bad? How do we ensure that people are driving under the right level of intoxication? At what age group do we decide that we can start to issue it versus the other? These are all issues that have long debates that need to be discussed and continue to be discussed as we refine the regulation, which is why I say it's different than decriminalization, where you just go, the end user is no longer thrown in jail, but we can still go after the people that are the criminal organizations that have the violence associated, that are recruiting youth into criminal activities. We can still go after that, but we're not punishing you for having a marijuana cigarette in your house. But at the same time, we're not able to make that switch today the same way that alcohol was ready, because it was previously legalized and regulated.
Merwan kind of pointed this out. Alcohol is a relatively simple substance relative to marijuana, and if you've got 234 levers that you can push back and forth opposed to 2, figuring out how that's going to play out. Because remember, at the current time, you don't have the intellectual capital of the world sort of focused on how you maximize the intensity of this.
Quick rebuttal?
I think an important question is, what would happen if we legalized marijuana? And I think it is exactly the question you bring up. And I think the answer to that is what would happen if we legalize it? I think not very much. I mean, if we legalize it, the question is, would all of us run out and have at it? And I mean, would we go outside of Kellogg between classes and see people, with a bong there? Or Mitchell, would you show up with a, having just had a little suck on the bong, and then have it teaching a class? And, the answer is no, you wouldn't see that. I mean, it's people don't show up usually for class, drinking, or you don't see most faculty members pouring a drink in the middle of class, or students too, and that's probably all good. And only because we know in society there's certain things we do at certain times, and there's certain things we do at other times. And the data also tells us, though, if you look at places where they've eased up on the regulations, you don't see everybody rushing out and saying, "Oh my gosh, now I've got to get go buy a paraphernalia for the home." What we see is actually it tends to decrease use when you legalize it. It's actually the reverse of what you would expect, and we see it all the time. So lots of other substances, people know how to regulate this.
So I think essentially what you just said was, the law has no impact on the decisions you make, because if we now change the law, people will not change the way that they act, and nobody ever has decided that they don't want to partake in smoking marijuana because of the legal issue. It's because of personal decision, personal morals, which I think is an outlandish statement to make. But I'd go back to my original opening statement, and I'd say cocaine, heroin, methamphetamines, prostitution, if there is no change in consumption and no change in behavior, why don't we legalize those as well if you have the same benefits associated?
So the subject is marijuana, obviously, and if we want to make a debate about cocaine, heroin, we'll make another debate another time. To come back on marijuana, there's something on which I really agree with you, is the impact on minors. I think it's a real subject. There is proof that teenagers which are using marijuana have a tendency to develop addicted pattern, they drop from school and things like that. And regarding this point, there should be a regulation regarding teenager. But for older population, we don't see this the same trend happening. They are not the same psychological effects. They are not the same health effects. There are studies which has been driven in states where marijuana has been legalized, and what we see actually is that when marijuana is legalized, underage people can't buy marijuana anymore because they are carded, and the crime is decreasing, and they don't supply marijuana anymore because most of their market is going to buy marijuana in medical marijuana center. So you see a big drop of the consumption for the teenager, and you also see an increase of consumption, but a small increase of consumption for the people who are above 18 years old. And then there is something super interesting because alcohol and marijuana are substitute products. So this increase in marijuana consumption has for effect to see the consumption of alcohol dropping. And with this drop, you also see the car accidents dropping by an average of 10% in the states where marijuana has been decriminalized. And this is this whole system which is very important to understand today by people who maybe will have to vote about legalization or not.
So let me stop this cycle and get another question. Yes, Alyssa.
So I have a question for Merwan and Professor Hawkins. We learned in Professor Hawkins' class yesterday that the state of Illinois is broke to the point that judges go to the doctors and the doctors don't get paid. So how do you see that already cash-strapped states will be able to pay for this regulation in a way that causes more benefits than harm to society?
Well, the economics of it, I think, are actually quite compelling, right? Because right now what happens is we invest in society, we invest an enormous amount of our resources in chasing down these dangerous marijuana users. So last year, what was it? In recent years, it was like 800,000 people a year were being arrested for marijuana consumption and put through the legal system. And you need constabularies, and you need judges, and you need people to prosecute all of these. Now, if you legalize it, the burden of prosecuting all this stuff goes away. Number one. Number two, you pick up tax revenue because, as was mentioned, you can set an appropriate tax rate that will both optimize revenue for the state and encourage and support the regulation that's behind it. I think the economic proposition is actually this is going to be a positive, big picture rather than a negative one that you see unfold.
I'd like to just put some data, some figure regarding this point. So I know that Professor Peterson has studied tax and different things. He's an expert about the subject. So I have to use a pool of 500 economic experts, including 3 Nobel Prize, including Milton Friedman, and I hope that will be enough in the balance with Professor Peterson. So all those economic people have produced a survey in 2005 stating that only on the federal budget impact, the saving on law enforcement would be 7 billion per year. The tax revenue would be 6.2 billion per year, including, and I agree with the fact that the price of marijuana will be decreased by a tenfold. But there are also, so this is a total for the federal budget of almost 15 billion a year. But there are also impact of legalization on the US economy. Today, marijuana is already legally the first cash crop in the US with $40 billion, which is twice as much as corn, and it's only in 15 states. So think about what will happen when it's going to be in 51 states. What you also have to know is that only in Denver, Colorado, there are 300 medical marijuana compassion centers, which is more than the number of Starbucks and McDonald's together. So the potential for the employment in the US is almost 500,000 people who can find a job in the marijuana industry. I think this is worth taking into account. And those figures are provided by 3 Nobel Prize and 500 economists.
Do you have a rebuttal to that?
Well, they're Nobel Prize in economics, right? And they studied marijuana and they studied tax. And that's the problem. It may not be their expertise. Remember, there's 2 steps here. One is decriminalization. So if you decriminalize it, that can take a lot of the cost out. If you go that incremental step to legalization, now you've got to have the infrastructure at the FDA to monitor the quality of the marijuana brownies. You've got to have the regulatory structure of getting the marijuana brownies from the production facility through the distribution to the grocery store, and when you go in, you need to be carded to know whether you have them. So that's why this RAND study was very interesting, because they're looking at the benefits of going on the legalization as well as that regulatory oversight. And those numbers that I talked about, that minimum one of about 300 or 200 million for California, 1.7 gross to the country, that's exactly the number. Now, a chunk of this, as I said, you can get from tax revenue. And so the numbers they were looking at, it was literally a $50 an ounce tax, which was about half the purchase price. In Canada, when they moved up the tax on cigarettes to $3 a pack, 30% of that market moved to the black market. And if what you're worried about, as Merwan said, is a very complex substance with 234 different varieties, now you might worry about quality if you're going to sell it to the broad population. So you don't want it moved to the black market because you lose the tax revenue. You don't want to move it to the black market because now you have no control of quality. And that's the one thing legalization does, is that regulatory overstructure.
We have time for one really focused question and two really focused answers. So who has a focused question? Yes, please.
So, first of all, thank you all for making this debate happen. So far, I think the 40 has done really well, because I think the context of this debate has shifted to what are the regulatory challenges that we face. So in a way, if regulation was
Focused question.
We appreciate your support, though.
So I am totally in for, but my only question to you is, does it harm society in terms of reducing the productivity of individuals when they are consuming alcohol? That's my only question for the four. Otherwise, I'm totally for you.
You have a supporter who wants to hear the clinching part of your argument.
There we go. Does it harm? The answer to that, I think, is no, because if you imagine what's going to happen is people are going to use this at the appropriate times, right? To suggest that when you legalize it, everybody's going to turn into stoners and nobody's going to be working anymore and society will fall apart. I mean, then you're suggesting that people can't regulate these things. And in reality, what we know is that there's all sorts of things we regulate. I mean, we don't drink coffee. I don't at 9 at night because I won't sleep at night, and I don't drink heavily in the morning when I'm teaching. And we learn to regulate it, and I think that's what's going to happen in terms of productivity. People know they have to work, they have to get a job. If you're showing up stoned to work every day, you'll be fired, and then you'll quickly learn that doesn't work. And I think people will figure it out.
Quick rebuttal.
Judging the ability to make this decision by our esteemed opponents is the wrong way to do it, because they're exceptional people. But there is a group of society that does have self-control problems, and when you give them something like this that damages their ability to process, I think you do risk wiping out a part of the intellectual capital.
We're going to bring the debate to a close. Let me first ask you to give a round of applause to our esteemed professors. And a round of applause to our great student debaters. And thanks again to the KSA for organizing this and to doing such a good job of executing it and making us all look good, actually. So we have one last piece of business before we go off to our 1:30 classes, and that's to vote again on the resolution for the debate. And so we have our actually should be post-debate poll. The legalization of marijuana causes more benefits than harm to society.
Good job.
And we'll see what the breakdown is. It was 65 for, 35 against. A few more votes this time. Less undecided, perhaps. Some votes still going up on the board. I'm going to close the poll. Whoa!